Hello folks, hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at the third and final book in the Empire of the East trilogy by Fred Saberhagen. This was written in the late 60s through the mid 70s, and this final book was written in 73. And it's published in a couple of different forms. It was originally published under the title Changeling Earth, so if you want to consider it Changeling Earth, I'll go ahead and probably consider that the appropriate title. Later on, it's been reprinted. So for example, in this trilogy, as Ardneh's World. You may also be familiar with it under that title too, under the Ardneh's World title. Now this series, this trilogy of books from the Empire of the East, has been cited by Gary Gygax, famously in his Appendix N, but in other places too, as a big influence on Dungeons & Dragons. Appendix N was an appendix at the end of the Dungeon Master's Guide in the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, where he talks about all the influences and also places where you can go to dig down for some things in his campaigns and such. So this is an example thus of a book that was considered very influential, and he puts down this series, but he actually specifically points to the third of these three books. So we're going to take a look at this. Now I've already reviewed for you the first two books in this series, so this will conclude this series, and I'll probably let Fred Saberhagen be for a bit. Fred Saberhagen is an interesting writer. He's written tons and tons of things in the three genres that this channel covers. He's written Dracula stuff that would be, kind of in the horror that my channel considers. He's written stuff in the science fiction genre, including potentially this, based on how you view science fiction, although it's very, very, very soft science fiction. But he also does things like the Berserker series with satellites that are killer satellites and so forth that are coming around and trying to kill people from a dead race, and stuff like that, as well as stuff within the fantasy realm too, like the Complete Book of Swords. So he has stuff in all three of the genres that I like to unpack from classics and such. I have talked about him a little bit. He was in my own Appendix N, not this series actually, but his book series on the swords is in my own Appendix N. I'll link you to that in the comments below, so you can click on that and go take a look at my own personal influential top 10 fantasy works that are still with me today and have stuck with me ever since I read them, and so forth. Now he's writing as somebody writing of his time. The Empire of the East is basically a post-apocalyptic fantasy, and a post-apocalyptic fantasy was a pretty strong concept during this time. There were many writers that were writing post-apocalyptic, not science fictions, but fantasies. And when I say that, there is some sort of an apocalyptic event that happens to a world like Earth or Earth itself in the future, and after that apocalyptic event occurs, the world turns back to a more fantasy style of world rather than a more traditional sort of science fiction post-apocalyptic work. And there are many examples of this. And some of them will blend them together, I think, very nicely, like Hero's Journey by Stephen Lanier. But there are many, many examples of this, like Moorcock does this with his Hawkmoon series. You're seeing this here in Saberhagen too. I would argue that Brian Aldous' Hothouse is more of a post-apocalyptic fantasy than a post-apocalyptic science fiction. Although he sold it as a science fiction, it actually won the award for Best Hugo Novel for Science Fiction. And so it was published under that. But I would consider it more of a fantasy than a science fiction story and so forth. But there's a lot of these sort of genres at the time. It was pretty big to have a lot of these sort of fantasy things that are happening. It was also a part of the Dying Earth sort of concept too, under Jack Vance or Clark Ashton Smith and so forth, that were writing sort of these tales near the end of the world, and magic that had left the world before we came is now back in the world again, and along with these elder gods and so forth too have returned too. And they're not nice. And so that's also kind of very much something that you're seeing here in this three book series of Empire of the East. Now again, the post-apocalyptic fantasy of Fred Saberhagen in this trilogy in particular is a post-apocalyptic fantasy. So in this particular case, you're going to learn in books 2 and halfway through book 3 all the backstory of the world. You're basically in this trilogy, you're following this main character Rolf and a few other characters too, as they move from setting to setting to setting. And in the first one, they're fighting over this tank and some other stuff too, and finding out who the bad guys are. This is the Empire of the East. And you have these various powers of the West that are trying to build up so they can take out the Empire of the East, which is led by a demon. And you're really going to be introduced to that demon in that Empire of the East a little bit more in the second book of the series, and so forth, which is pretty cool. And the second book of the series is set over in the mountains. They've now moved over and so forth. It introduces some new characters, some new concepts and so forth. And then here now in the third book, Ardneh's World, we're basically going to conclude the series and you're going to find out some of the backstories of so forth. I'm going to give you a quick little synopsis so you can see how zany and bizarre Saberhagen's world is. This world is created, like I mentioned, during a post-apocalyptic world. And what had happened was there was this defense computer network, which was designed to defend against sort of nuclear wars, nuclear attacks, and so forth. And this was written before War Games, the movie, but I think War Games, the movie, will definitely, if you're familiar with that movie, you're going to be familiar with this basic concept of a big giant computer that's super intelligent, that's designed to defend itself against, and you, as the people who made it, against nuclear attacks and such. And that's basically what this was, and it's called Ardneh. And Ardneh was an intelligent computer that had the ability to change the laws of physics temporarily in order to stop a nuclear bomb from going off. And so it did that when some nuclear attacks were launched and so forth. The enemy had a similar device similar to Ardneh. It did the same thing. Unfortunately, those two things collided and clashed together, and they changed the world permanently and pushed it back to a fantasy world again. Although technology still works, you're still chasing down old technology and so forth as a part of the plot lines, like the tank in the first book and so forth. And you're still doing that again and so forth. But one of the things that happens is that there's this nuclear bomb that, while it was being exploded and being attacked and so forth, it was transformed into this demon. And it's the demon that is running the Empire of the East now as its emperor. And has been for hundreds of years. And so you'll find out that this person is actually a transformed nuclear missile that was transformed during its destruction into a demon. Now that's just a bizarre and zany concept. And of course, what's going to end up happening is Ardneh's still there, super intelligent and so forth. And of course, what's going to end up happening is that these two empires, the Empire of the East and its ruler, and the Empire of the West, although it's less of an empire, but the powers from the West led by Ardneh are going to clash, literal and in a literal figurative battle, which I actually consider probably one of the best battles I've ever read. The battle between the demon that was once a nuclear missile and the creature that was once a defense computer, and so forth. And now they have both been changed in the great change that occurred over the course of this world. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time giving you sort of the details of the story, because, again, I don't want to give you a lot of spoilers. If you want to go check it out, I think you should do it. This book has all three of the books in it. So if you could pick up a book like this, you're going to have a pretty easy read. Fred Saberhagen followed the pattern of his time, where many of these sort of things will have lots of ideas and story building in a very short amount of space. He understood the craft of getting somebody into the space and then getting them back out again. And so here, let me give you an example. Ardneh's world begins on page 367 in this textbook. Well, not textbook, in this book. And then it finishes about 507. So it's about 150 pages long in this book, so it's probably about 200 pages in a normal sized novel or something like that. And that's it. It's not a read that's going to take you a long time. You can probably finish it in one day if you give 3 or 4 hours, give it 3 or 4 hours worth of your time. I read it the first time in one sitting, actually, but I read the whole. I read each of these across 3 days, and so forth. So again, I'll put the pause button, but understand that it's not a long read and it's not a hard read by any stretch of the imagination. Although some fun things are going to happen in it. It's very bizarre, and that's again very much par for the time. And again, it's very influential on, according to Gygax, on some of the things that happen in Dungeons and Dragons and so forth. One of the major demons in Dungeons & Dragons that you'll be introduced to actually has the same name as the demon from this trilogy and so forth. But it's fun. And many of his things, like the Book of Swords, will take place in the same world, only a lot further in the future. So he'll continue to write in this world, but he'll just move forward. And some of the characters will actually stay too. Like there's a main good guy in the second book who will continue moving forward in the rest of the trilogy and so forth. He was a dog who was changed during the change to a monster, but he still considers himself to be man's best friend, and so forth. So he does everything he can to help out people, and he's still going to be around. They call him a beast, but he's still going to be around moving forward. So there's a lot of these sorts of concepts and so forth. It's a very Saberhagen piece. It's a very 70s, late 60s piece. It also has a lot of the sort of allegories of the Cold War, because it was written at the height of it, during the 60s and 70s. So you're going to get a lot of this East versus West sort of style of writing, and the East is definitely depicted as evil, and the West, and this nasty empire of people that you have to really struggle against, Kafka, Soviet Empire, Kafka, whereas the West are this kind of coalition of good guys from various powers and potentates and so forth. Kafka, the good guys, Kafka, the US and their allies, and NATO. And so you can definitely see these sort of analogies and so forth in there. It's not hidden at all. Saberhagen isn't subtle about this stuff at all, right? And so anyway, Similarly, the nuclear war that happened between the NATO and the Soviet powers is what exactly, and those sorts of things and so forth are definitely things that you're seeing in this book itself. So there you are. That's Empire of the East, and to finish up that trilogy for you. Have you read the trilogy? Have you read the third book, Changeling Earth or Ardneh's World? However, when you're reading it in its initial publication or its republication states, I'd be interested in talking with you about it further, unpacking about it. If there's anything that you want to talk about or discuss further, I'm happy to do it. If you disagree with my comments, I'm also happy to engage you in those in the comments below. Hey, if you watched this video this far, hey, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. We all have such busy days and busy lives, so the fact that you spent some of this time with me is really humbling. And hey, if you like this video, there's no reason not to hit that subscribe button. As I just mentioned, I really do like to unpack a lot of these sort of classics of forgotten science fiction, fantasy, and horror story. And since this is kind of a blend of science fiction and fantasy, it's definitely a nice option for this channel, and also because it was influential too. So if you like this, feel free to hit that subscribe button because there's a lot more to follow. And once again, thanks again.